Hi.
Hi. That image that you have when you come onto Zoom that shows you sort of like morphing or something like that. That is so
Yeah.
cool. So you have this very famous paper that everybody has read, which is what you can't expect when you're expecting. And I'm sure you've explained it 1,001 times and given, many, many talks on this topic. So I don't want to have you belabor the main things about it. I'll try to give a very concise summary of how I understand it. And then I have this idea that I've been discussing with my postdoc, Daniel Villager, who I think you must know, or at least you must know his work because he writes on
Yep.
transformative experience.
Yep.
Okay, so you use the example of becoming a parent for the first time, which is what the title is a play on, as a potentially transformative experience, which is something where unless you've had the experience, you don't know certain things you would need to know to be able to rationally decide whether to have the experience. So there's this kind of, I don't know, catch 22 epistemologically. And
Mhm.
then there's the knowledge bit, which is the epistemically transformative dimension, and then there's the personally transformative dimension, which is that your very values structure and what it's like to be you could change so much that if you're trying to assign a sort of subjective value, how good would something be for you specifically? It's not just that you don't know what it'll be like, but you don't know how good it will be for you because you might be different on the other end of the experience. In terms
Right.
of at least a concise summary, is that a fair account of what you're trying to argue?
Yeah, I think so let me see. On the one hand, it's that, for certain kinds of big life changes like becoming a parent, one of the things that matters a lot, it's not the only thing, is basically what life is going to be like for you as a parent, how it's going to change you. And the subjective value is like what I think of as like, what life is going to be like for you. And it's not just phenomenology, it's about like all these other things, that you care about, like um, time for things like work or
No.
exercise or friends or all these things, right? So,
How it all fits together and the relative weights that you put on all sorts of things in your life might shift radically.
exactly. Exactly. Like, and I think there's like lived experience, and and how tired you're going to be, but how meaningful you'll find things and all this stuff. So, um, and then on the other side, you put it just right. The thought is that, like, look, you're trying to decide what you want, and the thing is that the you in the future is different from the you now. So there's like no univocal way of like determining this, and then you get kind of stuck because of the epistemological catch 22, as you put it. Like you can't know what it's going to be like for you until you actually do it. But that's what you want to find out before you decide to do it. And it also affects testimony because there's this weird thing about some experiences, and having a kid is definitely one of them, where like the process of actually having a child kind of reforms you in a way that often makes the person who results like just really happy that they did it or committed to doing it. But it's a little bit weird because if
Hmm.
like kind of having a frontal lobotomy in a certain way, like do you really want, like, you want to change yourself in a certain way so the person who results is super happy with the result, but maybe that wasn't who you wanted to be.
Yeah. And maybe it isn't
So there's
you.
yeah, that's like it's not you in one sense. It's maybe, it's you in an extent, like in a personal identity sense, even if it's a new self. That's
A
the way I like to think about
metaphysical, numerical kind of way. Yeah.
it. Yeah. But there's a sense in which it's you and a sense in which it's not you. And That's complicated then, right? Like, do you really want to bring this new self into existence, even if they'd be really happy that they existed?
Did you
So
write this paper upon becoming a parent, or before
I did.
becoming a parent? And
No,
was
I
it was
wrote
it related to that?
yeah, I wrote the paper about three, let me think. Um, Actually quite a ways into being to becoming a parent. I think I wrote the paper in like 2010. Didn't come out till 2015, but and I had my first child in 2004 and my
Mhm.
second child in 2007. But what happened was I had this kind of epiphany moment, when my daughter was my first child, and it was like 3 months old. And I was like, oh my, after sort of I recovered from the physical drama of like having
Yeah.
a kid, like this was so intense and so bizarre in this really interesting way. I can't believe that philosophers don't ever talk about, like they don't ever talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought, and there's like, it's metaphysically interesting, it's epistemologically interesting, it's decision theoretically interesting, like all this stuff, and nobody ever talks about any of it. So I was like, okay, I got to do something about
There are a
that.
lot of things that are like that. I mean, I remember reading a paper by Fiona Willard on sort of the philosophy and the ethics of monogamy, which is this hugely sort of central part of the culture that philosophers haven't really philosophized about. Another thing I've been talking to some people about is menopause, which is this,
Mhm.
again, can also be a radically, probably can be a transformative experience, I suppose. I don't know. Have you ever used that example in your theorizing?
Um, I haven't, but I think that's really it's wildly variable. So
Hmm.
like it's so I'm not sure. I mean I went through a menopause already and it wasn't a big deal for me, so it's kind of harder for
Right.
me to have
To
something
tap
useful to
into
say.
that for your own example.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. But
Well,
divorce is definitely transformative, I would say. So
right,
and marriage can be. So
right, right. Well, another example, which maybe we'll talk about, that I guess you were thinking about recently because there was a whole conference on this, is for some people, psychedelic experiences can be transformative. They don't know what it's like until they go through it, and it might be unlike anything they've experienced before, something they couldn't even really imagine themselves into before it happens. And it can change their sense of self and what they care about and the relative priority they place on things. And so this is where I'll make a bridge from the paper, the famous paper that we talked about, and this maybe new idea, which I don't know whether it has any legs, and maybe you can help me see if it does. So, in the case of becoming a parent, what I think is paradigmatic is that that's a decision that's made with someone. It's not always. I mean, sometimes somebody becomes a parent unwillingly or by surprise or whatever. But when you're talking about rationally making the decision whether to become a parent, in that paper, which I went and reread somewhat recently, it's really striking that you mentioned that there could be another person involved, but for the most part, it's like, do I want to become a parent as this, kind of rational decision that a person makes for themselves. And in the case of psychedelics, I've been writing for some years now about the possibility of couples undergoing psychedelic assisted marital therapy or couples therapy of some kind.
Mhm.
And there's a sort of medical ethics kind of relatively philosophically uninteresting question about what it means for two people to give consent to a medical treatment or something that might be medicalized. I mean, maybe it might not be. There might be drug assisted therapies that are available outside of the medical context. But either way, two people are making a decision, and at least it makes things more complicated because you might have coercion within the relationship. You might have one partner who wants to drag the other person to it, and you have to decide whether both of them are really willingly participating or whatever.
Mhm.
But now suppose that two people are making a decision about whether to undergo a potentially transformative experience, as it were, together.
Mhm.
Now, that's true in many cases of the shall we become parents, because it's not just that, each of you might change, but kind of who you are together might change. And
Mhm.
it's possible that the relationship might change. Now you have questions about whether this is like an
Yeah.
ontologically discrete unit, like
Yeah.
is the relationship greater than the sum of its parts? Is it just two individuals, 1 + 1 = 2? Or you have these old religious ideas like, the two become one. There's almost this metaphysical transformation that when you get married, you meld to each other in some way. So I don't know.
You could
Yeah,
also just say like when you've got a whole, you've got two halves, and so each part is different from the whole. And when you have
yeah,
a whole is something, it doesn't have to be more than its parts. It's just a new thing. Like
right.
there's B and you put them together and you've got the AB whole.
Yeah,
So I have to say that
yeah.
it's
And
you
you could
know,
even introduce a further thing here, which is, you could talk about the love that exists between people as sort of an entity unto itself. And,
hmm
that can change. Either the quality of it can change. There might be a question which could like numerically change. It could also come in and out of existence. I mean, you might have people who think that they love each other, and then they have a MDMA assisted couples therapy session, and maybe they find that they don't really love each other. Maybe they come to learn what it really is like to love each other, and then they sort of foster that kind of a thing. So it seems like love can come in and out of existence, and it can change qualitatively. The couple, like you're talking about, the kind of the whole of halves. Although I think many people feel like they want to be, two wholes coming together to create a super whole or something like that, rather than,
yeah, yeah,
their other
yeah.
half kind of story. But so I raised this with my postdoc Daniel. I said, has anybody written about transformative shared experiences? And he knows literature better than I do, and his impression was that people hadn't written about this. And so then I said, well, let's talk about it and see if there's something to write about. Maybe nobody's written about it because there's not really anything philosophically interesting to say.
hmm
So the first draft of this paper, we were trying to think whether there was anything decision theoretically interesting about it, because I'd say most of the literature on transformative experience and people commenting on you has been about this idea of whether you can make a rational decision according to classical decision theory, which has to do with assigning subjective value to future alternatives and then looking at the expected value and picking the one with bigger value. That would be a rational decision on this kind of classical view. And Daniel is very strongly of the view that there are no interesting implications for decision theory. And
Mm.
as best as I understand, as clarified through some recent emails, the reason why he thinks there's nothing interesting is that decision theory has to do with assigning subjective value. And subjective value requires consciousness and what it's like, and maybe some sort of sentience. This is things that can be pleasurable or painful or better or worse for you in some way, although that might not necessarily require subjective feeling. And so the thought is the couple doesn't have consciousness. Like
I see.
there's no
So for
seed of
there,
consciousness that, right?
so for there to be a decision theoretic implication for a couple to make the decision, there would have to be some kind of unified mind that could assign a unified subjective value. That's what he thinks. Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm not, I'm very reluctant
Talk
to.
about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there could still be something there. Now, maybe this is just different sensibilities that Daniel and I have. He's sort of like, well, they're two people with different minds, who each of
Mhm.
whom has, subjective value, and each of whom could make a decision. So for them, there's the traditional decision theoretic problem that you've talked about a bunch. It's just that each of them is having it. And, in making that decision, they'll of course take into account the welfare needs and the likely identity of their partner and so forth. That will be part of what factors into whether they think this is a rational decision or not. But there's no couple level um, decision that has subjective value qua couple rather than two
Yep.
partners to the couple.
Okay, so first, think about collective decision making,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
There's like lots of work about like collective decision making,
Groups
and
making a decision. Yeah, exactly.
exactly, and you can talk about a collective experience, right? So think about like Molly Crockett's really interesting work
Hmm.
on, right?
Burning Man. Yeah.
Exactly, collective experiences. So I think the question is, I see what Daniel was saying, and like on the way that I formulated the problem was definitely just for individuals. But you could, I think you could. So Jeff Sebo and I wrote a paper talking about effective altruism, and at the very end, we talked about collective transformative experiences very, very briefly.
Mhm.
Um, that's like one of the only places where, and also I think the pandemic
Yeah.
and was a collective social like a collective transformative experience. I think
Right.
um, interesting political revolutions and
Yeah.
elections can be collectively trans. So I think, and then the question is, well, what is this collective transformative experience? One model might be, well, it's just a bunch of individuals having their own little, each having their own little transformative experience, kind of somehow all at once or in some kind of related way.
Hmm.
But if you think that there is a sense in which there can be a collective group experience, doesn't necessarily require a shared mind, but where my relationship with the other person
Yeah.
affects my experience and their relationship with me affects their experience, then there's a kind of relational structure there. That means you could have a collective experience that only requires individual consciousness, but the experience is different in virtue of the network of relations that you're embedded in. So when you and I are friends or whatever, or you have your partner, or your
Hmm.
spouse or whatever, you can have I think you could have there could be like when you have dinner together or whatever experience that you have together, right? Engaging in some kind of thing that's kind of a loving event. Um, there's the question of, is there some collective event that requires like mind melding?
Hmm.
Well, no. But if you want to say, yeah, like, we do something together, you get married or whatever, and
Hmm.
and that my sense of that other person's feelings, and also just all of these other things that I empathize and think I know about them affects how I am, right? And
Yeah, very
so
much so. I mean,
next value is going to be affected by them. Sorry, go on.
well,
So,
no, exactly. So that's the kind of line that I've been trying to push, and I'll tell you Daniel's response to it. But first, it's like, I think a lot about relationships. A lot of the stuff that I work on is relationships, and close relationships are your sense of self changes. And Now, do you meld consciousnesses with someone? Does it become a shared subjective point of view, so to speak?
Maybe.
Not
I don't think
probably
so. I
not.
mean,
Yeah.
someone could argue that, but I don't think.
My metaphysics doesn't stretch that far, but an identity changes, like who you are changes, and also even I would say the experience of making decisions changes, and
Mhm.
and I haven't been able to articulate exactly this experience of making a joint decision that's different from making an individual decision that takes into consideration the needs and interests of the other person. For some reason, they feel different to me, and
Mhm.
maybe it's just two descriptions of the same thing, and I haven't teased it apart yet. But Daniel seems to think that in order for the decision theoretic thing to be philosophically interesting, there would have to be a shared seat of consciousness or shared point of view. And I mean, we even do metaphorically talk about that. We talk about having a shared point of view, like, but he means literally, like, seeing out of
Yeah.
the same eyes, like conjoined twins or something with
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
brain and or
Yeah.
overlapping neural architecture or something.
I don't see that because I think collective decision making is perfectly possible. And I don't think you have to understand subjective value um, in a way that, like you can, like I said, if I'm affected by you and you're affected by me, when we collectively like make a decision, then our subjective value is affected by the collective task that we're performing.
Right.
So, and then the other thing I would say is, I think it's also really true that who we are is partly um like so we're the other side is the self, right? And
Yeah.
I think who I am is partly defined. I'm not all of my properties are like this, but some of my properties are relational properties. Like
Yeah,
I'm a
absolutely.
spouse, I'm a parent, I'm an
Exactly.
academic. And these are relational properties. I'm an academic in virtue of like being a professor at Yale and teaching and doing all the things, being hired by the institution. I'm a wife by, or a spouse, whatever, by being married to my husband. I'm a mother by having a certain relationship to the child that I produced. These are relations. And in virtue of this, I have relational properties. This is like, I'm a
Hmm.
metaphysician and I think about these things in a fairly, I think, like I'm very clear on what my metaphysics is with all of this.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which you can change who you are by changing your relational properties. That's exactly what I'm talking about when you become a,
Yeah.
a, a parent.
Yeah.
It's your relational properties change,
Yeah.
and that has a huge effect on your preferences, right? And kind of some of the things you care about most fundamentally.
Hmm.
So I'm just thinking about this on the fly, but
Yeah.
if we have this thing where so let's say okay, so my husband and I would need to make a collective decision. The My phenomenology is not just about phenomenology, but let's just think about we can just think about it like to start that way. My phenomenology is affected by him,
Yeah.
by what he thinks, what he believes by his phenomenology to the extent that he reports it to me, right?
Right.
Um, Evan Thompson has some really interesting work on being transformed by death, and he also thinks we're transformed by the death of others because we our lot, like the experience we have of
Yeah.
losing them, the pain that they go through, and
Yeah.
so for all these reasons, there's a sense in which the subjective value that I would might assign to experiencing, say, psychedelic transformation, right?
Hmm.
And also the transformation in how I feel towards the other person and responding to how the person changes for me. Seems to me we can come up with a kind. Like here's one problem. I don't know how I'm going to experience, let's say, the MDMA.
Yeah.
Um, um, I don't know how my spouse is going to experience the MDMA, and I don't know how through those changes our relationship is going to change, and so I'm going to experience a change in the relationship.
Yeah.
So there's no, it's not that you have to have a mind meld or something like that. It's rather that because um, I'm responsive to him and he's responsive to me, are kind of, you know, uh, my experience and his experience are both deeply related. And also, we can just kind of think of them as one and the other kind of added together as opposed to one unified thing. So, anyway.
Yeah. So that's really helpful. Okay. So phenomenology seems to be key. This is the sticking point between me and Daniel. So I just had a thought um, that I'll say and then come back to what you just said. So um, it seems like there are increasingly technological ways in which something like shared phenomenology might be able to exist with, there's brain computer interfaces and people are figuring out how to do like neuro chips and stuff. So maybe if we want to, if Daniel wants to take a hard line, maybe I'll just have him discuss a case that involves something like brain computer linking, but like brain to brain linking or something like that. If that's what he needs, is like literally
Or-
I'm experiencing the world as it were through your eyes, then okay, fine.
yeah. Some kind of
Um,
VR thing or something, maybe,
yeah,
or whatever.
yeah. So
Mhm.
if that's what's required, then maybe that is possible in that kind of literal sense. But even if that's literal sense is not possible, I feel like what you're saying seems enough to me for the rational decision to be different than just each individual making their own decision while accounting for
That's right.
factors relating to the other person. And one reason,
Oh,
and just to finish this point is it has to do with phenomenology and how we relate to the phenomenology of someone that we love. And I'm thinking of something like Iris Murdoch or Simone Weil or various traditions within which you take the other person's consciousness and reality seriously in a way that is very hard to do and that requires using your attention differently and that we don't often do with strangers, but maybe we should. And which, by the way, some people after they have a psychedelic experience, they suddenly become very Murdochian and they're sort of like, wow, it's this stunning realization that something other than myself is real. And that there's a seed
yes.
of consciousness out there that's just as important, as it were, from its perspective as mine is to mine. And then
Yeah.
noticing that and internalizing that does change how you treat people. It changes how you relate to the whole world. And so what love partly is on this kind of Murdoch Weil type view is precisely like attending to someone in such a way and appreciating that their phenomenology, not just them existing in the world as another object among other objects, but
The
their
way it's like
subjective point of
them.
view, like matters to you and becomes part of your value structure in a way that
Absolutely.
it doesn't
Yeah.
if you don't love the person.
And it's not just phenomenology, it's beliefs and attitudes and cares.
Hmm.
And so the thing is, I think I sometimes weirdly, I think sometimes some of the decision theoretic people were like, oh, well, it's just mere phenomenology and that's not what matters. I'm like, look, human beings, you and I both do enough psychology to know that human beings you can't just pull apart like what something is like for you and the content of your beliefs and attitudes, and so um so the changes in beliefs and attitudes are also going to change basically what it's like to be you in various ways. So it's like the what it's like thing is how can I put it, like intimately bound up with a lot of content as well. I just want to mention that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
um, you know, and so then right, part of the thing is that you become much more sensitive to the subjective value of the other person, basically what they care about, how they care about, what it's like for them. That changes your sensitivity, changes what it's like for you basically. And so the puzzle might get going because you don't know, not only do you not know what it's like for you to undergo psychedelics, what you don't know is how your collective interactions, how your
Yeah.
coupledom,
Yeah.
going to change. And that's just follows straightforwardly from not knowing I mean, especially it's even more complicated because you've got two people
Yeah.
and you don't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know, or they don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. That just kind of magnifies the possibilities of, being unable to assign a value to the collective experience that you're about, that you're going to undergo.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Makes total sense to me. Now,
Okay.
now the more I think through it, I think it's interesting. Just have to kind of work out the metaphysics in a particular way. I think just to kind of.
Yeah. And okay. And so then the other aspect of this is about authenticity, which here Daniel thinks there is a there. So he thinks that there could be couple level authenticity considerations.
Mm.
And I don't feel as confident that I understand your arguments about authenticity as I do the first bit that I discussed. So this will also be very helpful to hear your take. And then maybe I'll relay this back to Daniel and see what he thinks.
Mm.
So one let's just stick with individual decision making. So let's say I'm deciding whether to move countries or something like that, or whatever it might be, something that's relatively individualistic. Let's think of it that way. um I don't know what it's like to be on the other end. I don't know, or I'm deciding whether to get bitten by a vampire or whatever it is. um I one thing I
My
might be able to
favorite,
do. What's that?
my favorite example.
Yes. Yes, exactly. One, because it's so striking, it really helps sharpen your intuitions, when you think about things in those ways.
Mm.
Um, so somebody might say, well, of course I can make a rational decision about this. I can just ask what other people did and whether they liked it. 89% of people seem to really favor becoming a vampire. So, unless I'm totally unusual, statistically speaking, it seems likely that's a perfectly rational way to make that decision. What's wrong with that? Now,
Mhm.
as far as I know, you sort of concede that that's some sort of information a person could and might maybe well should use when making such a decision, but that it would lack a certain sort of authenticity because you'd be making the decision on the basis of facts that pertain to people that aren't you. And that part of what authenticity is making a decision based on who you are. And now, partly who you are, and this gets in, again, interestingly into the metaphysics of identity. Like we are also partly constituted by our cultural milieu and by, the relationships we have with groups, not just the relationships we have with ourselves. So it might be that taking into consideration, others' testimony is not so inauthentic. I mean, but there's a sense in which if I'm just deferring sort of um, in a facile way to some statistical pattern, I can see how that doesn't really feel authentic. And then there's a whole, obviously a massive literature about what does authenticity even mean and how does it relate to the self. And so I want to understand your conception of authenticity specifically as it's deployed in these arguments. And then maybe if we can see why Daniel thinks that there could be couple level authenticity questions raised by a shared transformative experience that haven't been discussed before and might be worth discussing philosophically.
Okay, right. So the thought with authenticity was that, yeah, you should like, I mean, it's completely right to take into account like whatever statistical evidence there is and things like that. But and the way that I originally put the point was to say, look, you can take that information into account and you should, but if that's all you've got, then I think there's a problem. I mean, you can if it's all you've got, but there's a sense in which you think you're deciding kind of based on how can I put it, facts about yourself. I think things start to get a little bit sketchy because you need something else. And what you need is a solution to the reference class problem.
Right.
So you don't just need statistical evidence. You need to know that evidence refers to you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and the way that I think about it is you need to know how that evidence affects you, like
Mm-hmm.
why it refers to you. Because the ordinary thing we do when we hear about testimony, for example, especially if we don't like the results or whatever, or we think, I don't, it doesn't apply to me,
Yeah.
one might say, because I hear about some fact about the demographic group that I'm a member of, and like, or my kind of education and kind of whatever social status or financial wealth. I think, oh yeah, those are all important things, but those are not the properties that matter.
Yeah.
Well, how do I decide that? Well, because I'm making a judgment about like whether I'm a member of that population or not, right? Um, and I just don't see where that's going to come from if you have no information whatsoever about, like, in other words, you use what you think it's going to be like for you, or what do you think matters for what it's going to be like, to judge that you're a member of that population.
That's interesting.
This has not come out like I don't think I said it as clearly as I should have in the book in 20
Mm-hmm.
and or in the paper early on. And weirdly, even though I've said it later, um, I kind of feel like um people have kind of a little bit missed the point.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, maybe not. And I have so Al Hayek has a paper that's really good called "The Reference Class Problem is Your Problem Too,"
Mm-hmm.
um, which is a great title.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so one issue is if you are judging that you are or are not a member of this reference class, I question, without, if you have no information about how it's going to affect you, like what the grounds are that you're using to kind of make this judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So then, if you can't do that, you have to just say, okay, it's just probability. It's just straight probabilities, right?
Right.
I'm female, I'm a member of a certain demographic group, and they tend to be fairly broad brush social characteristics. It's not like somebody who's like my perfect duplicate in any reasonable way.
Mm-hmm.
So then I make my decision based on that. And I find that to be, I think that's inauthentic, because I think it's like you're kind of just gambling or rolling the dice rather than using any specific information about yourself in the way that I think authenticity should tell us that we're supposed to do.
Okay, this is sparking a lot of thoughts. So there's this long-standing debate in bioethics about predicting patients' preferences when they're incapacitated.
Mm.
And you're supposed to use a substituted judgment standard in the US, use different standards elsewhere. But the idea is you're supposed to choose as they would choose if only they currently had capacity. But unfortunately, they're in a coma, so you have to figure out how are you going to decide what it is that they would want. Now, maybe they had a conversation with you about it, and then you have this
Yeah.
direct testimonial evidence, and you can say they always said if they were ever in the situation, they would want life-sustaining treatment withheld. But
Yep.
most people haven't had that conversation. So there's this real dilemma. And, various studies suggest that next of kin are only about 50% accurate when you just ask, like, what do you want to have happen under this situation? And then you ask your husband, and he's going to be 50% likely to get it right on average.
Mhm.
So this guy, Dave Wendler and his colleague Annette Ridd had this idea they call the patient preference predictor, which came out probably 10 years ago, where they said what you should do is you should survey the whole population. I mean, a random sample of the population. You should give them a bunch of cases, like imagine you're in a coma, imagine there's a 50% chance of survival, imagine, what would you want? And then you
Mhm.
feed that into an algorithm, and then you have a patient in front of you, and you just plug in their demographic characteristics. So,
Mhm.
well, it turns out that there's a pretty strong predictive relationship between things like whether you're female and you're 35 and what kind of beliefs you have and what's your socioeconomic. You can predict better than average, better than a human
Yeah.
surrogate. So
Yeah.
his view is as long as what you care about is just getting it correct, the right answer,
Yeah.
bare
Yeah.
statistical evidence
Yeah.
will actually help you here. You'll get the right
Yeah.
answer. But a lot of
Yeah.
people objected to this and said, it's not that I want the right answer. I want people to make this decision for the right reasons. I want them not just
Yes.
to get to be correct in what I would choose. I want them to get to know what I would choose because I would choose it, not I, qua member of the class of persons who share these sort of broad features that are precisely the things that are not distinctive about me.
Yeah, about knowing who I am as a person.
Yeah.
So it's not, and the point is not that, like, look, if you haven't got any other information, use the probabilities. Nobody's saying to ignore those. The
Mhm.
point is that it's a second tier, it's a
Yeah.
second tier solution, right?
Right.
It's like it's a substitute for something else that we want. And so there's a loss there. Can I just add one more thing, by the way?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a complication with all of this. With even the case you described, because what if the person undergoes a transformative experience as they went through this kind of dying process? Or think about
Yeah.
somebody, I've heard
Exactly.
about this, like Alzheimer's patients and stuff like that, right?
Exactly.
Like, so there's this further complication, just going back to what we were talking about before. If they're not the same self that they were,
Yeah.
then which pattern do you apply to them, right? So,
Well, exactly. And the thing is that often the very situations that people are being asked to make decisions about are ones that tend to be transformative, like near-death experiences. And so it's almost like this is why people have debates about advanced directives, which go back even longer. Like, are
yes.
they valid? Are you the same person? You know, there's the
And these things
Dworkinian
might
view, but yeah.
these things might be related because if I think people feel, rightly or wrongly, that if they really understand the reasoning that the person would use, then they might be able to go, oh, well, this person would have been transformed, so maybe we can't rely on this by the process, or this person wouldn't have been transformed, and so we can rely on this. There might be an interesting wrinkle on top of that, like, um,
So, okay, here's one more idea, and then I realize you probably need to go. It's your evening time, but uh, so I've been writing about these digital doppelgangers lately. So you can take a large language model and you can fine tune it on a specific person's all the written material. So you can have a you can make a chatbot that would pass a linguistic Turing test, a
yeah,
personalized Turing test. So
yeah,
if it was just me
yeah,
chatting or if it was my chatbot chatting, you wouldn't know the difference.
yeah.
Now we can
People
stipulate
have
it
been
has
doing,
yeah.
yeah.
What's that?
People have been doing
Yeah,
this
they've been
now,
doing
apparently.
this now. Yeah, exactly. But it's just become technologically much easier than it ever was before. So I have fine-tuned a chatbot on all of my publications, and now I can put in a title and an abstract of the paper that I want to write, and then I can press, return, and it will spit out a draft in my voice using my reasons and these kinds of things. It's very creepy. Now, I haven't used this to write a paper because I think it's very ethically complicated, and I've written a paper about the ethics of this. Um, but uh, So probably these digital doppelgangers don't have subjective consciousness, but they do encode your beliefs, your preferences, your values, and so forth, insofar as those are reflected in the linguistic evidence that you've scattered around in emails and text messages and everything else. And so I just had this idea the other day that, this classic problem, people say, if only I could, we have to live life in one track, and there's all these alternative worlds that we might have done if I'd become a doctor, if I kept acting in my own case. Life life might have been very different, but you can only live life in one direction. But if you make a digital doppelganger, you could put it through simulations. You could take something that pretty closely
Mhm.
tracks your preferences, your values, your beliefs, your mannerisms, your idiosyncrasies, and so forth. It doesn't have subjective experience, but you could run it through simulations. You could, have it be a doctor and see whether it's happy or,
Yeah,
and so forth.
yeah.
And so I'm sort of wondering if it if this could get around the transformative experience thing, where if you could have your doppelganger go through the transformative experience or a simulation of it and sort of report back to you, that kind of
Mhm.
testimony is different, right, than just the bare statistical evidence. Now, again, you have the problem that they don't have subjective experience, but I don't. I mean,
Yeah, I'm not so worried about that. I just
yeah.
remember though that that doppelganger is you in the broad sense, but the person who go like the it's like, who would I have been if I had never had children?
Hmm.
And I mean, so imagine, I guess you don't have children, right? So I imagine talking to my doppelganger now, and I've been a mother now for 20 years. Um, Talking to the person who I would have been if I had never had children. And I would get their testimony, but there are all kinds of interesting questions that come up about how I'm supposed to interpret that testimony and how to think about it. So maybe it would be really good. It would be a way of solving the reference class problem of knowing how I would at least what I would testify to after the
Yeah.
after the particular transformation.
Yeah.
And there is a sense in which um, is I think the real question is it's interesting. The real question is um, would it be enough to have your doppelganger make the decision, right? Um, like I don't think you could go get testimony from the like someone else could go get testimony from the doppelganger and make this because there's this
Hmm.
problem about transformation. If they were transformed under this, then there's this way of how do I interpret the testimony? But if
Yeah.
your doppelganger could be the one who
Yeah.
could make the decision, because then your doppelganger has been on both sides of and so maybe they don't have subjective experience, so maybe there's a problem there. I'm not sure. Maybe they,
Mm.
maybe, there might be some complications, but that's the interesting case, right? Because if you can, because they would be able to be like, well, I was once in your shoes. I was once you, and this is how I would evaluate things. And now I'm going to make this comparison and make the decision. I still think there'd be interesting things to say about that. Like, I think some people would still feel uncomfortable, but it pushes the discussion forward in a really interesting way. Um,
Okay, well, this has been very heartening because I was feeling a bit de dejected that this spark of an idea maybe was not going to kindle into anything. But this has been such a rich conversation. But I've been gripped by these possibilities, the transformative shared experience thing, and also what happens when any of us can pretty quickly make a pretty reliable digital twin of ourselves. And
yeah.
I think that there's metaphysical questions that are very interesting. There's ethical questions that are very interesting. And I think people are just now beginning to take them seriously because before it was science fiction. And now it's like totally not science fiction as of,
Yep.
last year, essentially.
Yep. Yep. But they're really there's something really good here. I think there's actually like we just talked about a number of things. Like there's a number of things that are I think um pretty interesting.
Well, that is encouraging. And thanks for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, the cool ideas, Brian. I think they're really interesting. So yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Take
All
care,
right.
Laurie. Bye.